Good morning. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Deputy Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and I want to welcome you all here this morning. Thank you for coming. This session today will be looking at some of the challenges, looking at the developing world. Next Friday, there will be a second session, I believe, in Brazil, China, and Russia, looking at different perspectives of what you might confront in the 111th Congress. And we're very happy to be here. We're all an email contact and can be reached by phone as well if you have anything you would like to follow up on. You have the bios of our three speakers from the staff. Two of them have considerable experience on Capitol Hill. Cindy Arnson was here, I guess, as an intern about 1977. And also worked on Capitol Hill between 1983 and 1988. Howard Wolpe was representative from the state of Michigan for, I believe, 7 terms before becoming ambassador to the Great Lake region during President Clinton's term of office. And I was on the House Foreign Affairs Committee for 29 years, ending in 1998. So we thank you for being here. The Woodrow Wilson Center is a national living memorial honoring President Woodrow Wilson, linking the worlds of ideas and public policy to address current and future domestic and international global challenges. The center fosters research and dialogue relevant to understanding and formulating policy and instrumental in enhancing the capabilities and knowledge of leaders, citizens, and institutions worldwide. Created by an act of Congress 41 years ago, the Center is a nonpartisan institution supported by both public and private funds. We do receive roughly a third of our resources through an appropriation. So you have the bios. I think we'll proceed alphabetically. Cindy Arnson, who directs the Latin American program, will speak first. Our speakers will speak for roughly 10 to 12 minutes, and then we're going to open it up and try and have a dialogue with you. And we ask that those that work on Capitol Hill ask the questions first. So, Cindy, it's yours.
Great. Mike, thanks very much, and thanks to all of you. It's a rare pleasure to be on this side of the table in this building. I'd like to give an overview of some of what I think are the key developments in Latin America and in U.S.-Latin American relations, and leave mostly for the discussion period a closer look into the kinds of issues that are likely to make their way onto Capitol Hill in the coming year. The first point that I want to emphasize is the economic context. All you have to do is read the headlines in the Washington Post or the New York Times to know that the economies of the United States, Europe, and Japan are all in recession and indeed experiencing negative levels of growth. Globalization and the reforms in the 1990s that opened the region's economies have integrated Latin America more deeply into the international financial system and into global markets. And because of that, reduced demand in the advanced industrial world, particularly for the primary commodities whose prices boomed in the last 4 to 5 years, has sent Latin American economies into a tailspin. This is an economic crisis that has originated in the advanced industrial world, not in Latin America, but the effects are very much being felt. The prices of oil, of metals, of agricultural commodities have virtually collapsed. The robust economic growth that was experienced by most countries in the region over the last several years has come to a standstill. The figures put out by the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean show that in 2008, the beginning of the global recession, regional growth on average was less than 2%, is projected to be less than 1% in the coming year, and in some countries actually going into the negative area, countries including Mexico and Argentina. This all occurs at a time when the Latin American and United States economies are highly integrated and connected. About a fifth of all U.S. trade, imports and exports, is with countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Because of the crisis and even earlier, there had been calls throughout the region for a new thinking and the development of new international financial architecture, and also for a new round of thinking about the role of the state in the economy, not only as in this country to protect the most vulnerable sectors, but also to have a more permanent and not transient role in regulating markets. And this is obviously, I think, in direct counterpoint to the trend of a decade or so ago, when the Washington Consensus and the opening and liberalization and removal of the state from the economies was the dominant ideology behind economic development. A second broad development in the region has to do with the emergence of alternative leaderships in the hemisphere. Much has been said and written about the oil diplomacy, the so-called oil diplomacy of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, and his use of not only oil, but of billions of dollars in oil revenues to build and consolidate an anti-U.S. bloc in the hemisphere. More important, I think, in both regional and global, on the regional and global stage, however, is Brazil, which will be the subject of next week's discussion, so I don't want to steal too much of my colleague Paulo Sotero's thunder. But I do want to just point out that Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world with respect both to territory and to population. Its economy is the 10th largest in the world. Its industrial base is perhaps the most advanced certainly in Latin America and among the most advanced in the developing world. Under the leadership of the current President Lula, Brazilian foreign policy has centered on South America, on the creation of UNASUR, the Union of South American countries, and the exercise of leadership in a number of hemispheric crises, from the Colombia-Ecuador border crisis that erupted, I think it was in May of last year, to the threat of growing polarization and political violence in Bolivia through 2007 and 2008. It also has about a 20-year jump on the United States and other advanced industrial countries in the production of ethanol and other environmentally sustainable technologies. It does certainly not hurt Brazil's or even Venezuela's ambitions in the region that Bush administration policy over these last 8 years in Iraq, but I think more generally a policy of unilateralism has contributed to a surge of anti-U.S. feeling throughout the hemisphere, to which I think is contrasted an almost sort of iconic status achieved by our new President Barack Obama. A third broad area has to do with Mexico. The United States and Mexico are deeply integrated on issues of trade, migration, and security. And there is probably no single relationship in Latin America of greater importance to the United States than the relationship with Mexico. Mexico is the third largest U.S. trading partner, primarily as a result of NAFTA. It is the second largest destination for U.S. Exports. I think Canada has the distinction of being first. Approximately a third of all immigrants to the United States come from Mexico, and today about 12 million Mexicans live in the United States, about half of them without full legal documentation. A fourth area of concern or a fourth area of priority in the U.S. hemispheric relationship has to do with the way that free trade agreements have become proxies in a larger struggle and debate over the winners and losers in globalization. Rising protectionism in this country, in a lot of countries, especially at a time of economic downturn, is, in my view, not in anyone's interest. But so far, our political leaders have not done a very good job at ensuring that the approval of FTAs with individual Latin American countries are coupled with strong measures that are seen and perceived in the United States as supporting U.S. workers, both in terms of expanded and effective trade adjustment assistance and other protections such as portable health care, all within a context of rising inequality in this country over the last 30 years. I'd like to end with a word about Colombia. Colombia has experienced substantial and I think widely recognized and even admired progress under the Uribe administration in consolidating democratic security, in reducing the number of homicides, of kidnappings, and in setting back militarily the largest insurgent group, the FARC. There has been some attention in Congress to now attempting to shore up the gains in the security field with parallel and supportive gains in the area of social and economic development. One area in which our Colombia policy, I think, needs a serious amount of rethinking is that despite approximately $6 billion in U.S. military and counter-narcotics and economic assistance since the beginning of Plan Colombia in 2000, it was approved by Congress, there is more cocaine exported from the Andean region now than there was at the beginning of Plan Colombia, and there is more coca grown in Colombia than there was at the beginning of the Clinton-Pastrana agreement. So I think that we need to think about ways to couple to supply reduction strategies, mostly aimed at eradication in Latin America, with a much more concerted effort at reducing demand for illegal narcotics in the United States. And we'll end there.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Gib Clarke runs the Global Health Initiative at the Center.
You might want to point out that there are some chairs scattered throughout here and in the back there that people don't have to be standing.
Half a dozen chairs in and around, and there are even chairs behind us. Gib.
Thank you very much. As Mike said, my name is Gib Clarke. I'm the coordinator of the Center's Global Health Initiative. I also serve as a senior program associate to another program at the Center called the Environmental Change and Security Program. Quick commercials on both of them. The Environmental Change and Security Program, that's a long name, but basically we look at the intersections of environment, security, and demographic issues. And the Global Health Initiative looks broadly at health issues around the world, but with a special emphasis on financing issues, post-conflict and post-disaster health, and maternal health. This is an exciting time for global public health. In the last decade, there's been more attention and more money than perhaps ever before poured into the issue. Progress has been made in some key areas, but much remains to be done, clearly. In the past, the struggle for the community has really been to get more money and more attention to the issues. But recent dialogue, and I think moving forward, there's going to be a focus on the most effective allocation and the best use of funds, things such as strengthening health systems, increasing focus on prevention issues, finishing certain so-called unfinished agendas such as maternal health, child mortality, and family planning. There's still obviously a strong call and I believe a significant need for more funding. Bill Gates, in his annual letter, which was just released earlier this week, noted that continued funding is needed to enhance current successes in R&D, vaccines, distribution of goods, service delivery, et cetera. And even in the economic downturn, he noted that these investments need to continue since we're targeting the poorest of the poor, and these are the people who are the most affected by downturns. I'm going to talk quickly about 4 issues which I think are significant now and will be discussed a lot moving forward. The first of those is diseases. I'm going to be brief on this because I think this has gotten the most attention and the most funding as well. 3 of the biggest causes of mortality and morbidity or illness in the world are HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. There are 2.7 million new infections of HIV every year. The majority of those are in Africa, though there are 200,000 every year in the Latin American Caribbean region. There are about 300 million new cases of malaria, causing almost 1 million deaths every year, and there are about 9 million cases of TB every year, causing about 1.5 million deaths. The response to these diseases has been significant, especially lately. The PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for HIV/AIDS Relief, in 2003 was passed for $15 billion over 5 years. That reauthorization last year was for $48 billion in 5 years. And that's just the American government response. There's the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, and obviously other governments and other foundations responding to the crisis. We have our Presidential Malaria Initiative, which puts about $1.5 billion annually. And there is the Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Inoculations, which also spends in the billions of dollars on those issues. Moving forward, I think there's going to be obviously continued talk about these diseases. There needs to be a sustained response, sustained funding. But I think that in the next year or two and moving forward, there's going to be a lot also of discussion on issues, health concerns that have not gotten much attention in the last few years. And there's a bunch of these, but I'm going to mainly focus on 3 here. These do not require as large of investments as the investment in HIV, largely because the solutions, if you will, the programs that are necessary to combat them are largely understood. But they are problems that have been with us for decades, even centuries, and require renewed funding and obviously need improvement as well. So plenty of reason for investment. The first one of these issues I want to talk about is maternal health. In the last 15 years, from 1990 to 2005, there's been almost no improvement in this area, a drop of only 576 to 536,000 deaths per year. There's also really high rates of morbidity or injuries and illness associated with childbirth. The interventions, the programs that are necessary include access to trained birth attendants, access to emergency obstetrics, and other basic services. Child survival, we've seen more progress. Between 1960 and 2008, we've halved the number of child deaths, but we've halved it to 10 million children every year, so it's still a huge problem. The contributing factors to that are pneumonia, diarrheal diseases, and undernutrition. So interventions and programs to address this are relatively simple, but include things like vitamin A supplementation, safe water, measles immunizations, malaria treatments. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about family planning. Many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, have stalled in their demographic transition. That basically means they have stopped their transition from being a country with high mortality and high fertility to being one with low fertility and low mortality. 2 examples of this are the Philippines and Kenya. The Philippines had 27 million people in 1960. They're about 93 million now, and they'll be at 140 million in 2050. Kenya similarly had 8 million in 1960, 40 million now, and about 84 million in 2050. This presents huge problems, obviously, to things like food security, economic growth, potentially even security, not to mention the stresses on already weak health systems. There's been a sharp switch between Presidents Bush and Obama on this issue. Just last week, President Obama reinstating the U.S. funding to the United Nations Family Planning Association, and there will likely be a lot more pressure to do more, with 5 former directors of USAID's Population Office issuing a paper a couple weeks ago to increase family planning assistance from $500 million to almost $1 billion in just the next couple of years. The list goes on for these unfinished agendas, these issues that have not gotten a lot of attention lately, but I'll just quickly name diarrheal diseases, tropical diseases like dengue and cholera, the growing rates of so-called first world diseases like cancer and cardiovascular disease, and of course pandemics like SARS and avian flu. I touched on funding, and I just want to make one quick point on it, aside from how big it is and that it needs to be sort of better coordinated given all the many players involved. And that is that funding could be a little more flexible in order to help meet the needs of the global community. Too often funds are directed specifically at one disease or one part of a health sector, neglecting other important influencing factors like poverty, environmental factors like water, and the quality of the health system itself. An example of a project going from originally rigid to more flexible is PEPFAR, which has added certain components that address malaria, pneumonia, diarrheal diseases in certain situations, and has added more focus and more attention and more money on prevention, and also added more preventive activities to the list of acceptable use of funding. There are those who think PEPFAR needs to be more flexible still, allowing for more country-specific flexibility, transitioning it from an emergency response to a sustainable response, and having the indicators of success be a little less number-based and more quality of service-based. And finally, I want to talk about health systems themselves. You can put as much money you want towards problems as you can, but your success will be limited by the strength of local and national health systems. A solid public health infrastructure requires having trained health workers, effective health policies, available supplies, good solid health finance systems, and strong information systems. These can be addressed in two ways. The first is you can do specific work with the health system, but specifically funders, including the U.S. government, can be a little more prescriptive in terms of writing the bills and ensuring that any program doesn't just address the disease, but also addresses the health system. The WHO, the World Health Organization, for example, argues that all technical areas need to have a health systems component, and the Lancet, which is one of the leading health journals, is arguing that the new PEPFAR coordinator, with the last one stepping down last week, should place a priority on integrating health system strengthening with the disease-specific responses. So I'll leave you with that, but I want to summarize just by saying there's plenty of reasons to be hopeful in the global health community. Global health and development in general is receiving unprecedented attention and funding. Strides are being made in key areas, but obviously a lot needs to be done. I apologize, I've left out 1,000,001 aspects of global health that deserve attention: specific diseases, health's broader role in development and diplomacy, and issues that affect health like infrastructure and urbanization. But I think my laundry list is long enough, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gib. Wolpe, Dr. Howard Wolpe will now talk about Africa. Howard.
Thanks, Mike. As I was listening to these earlier presentations, I was really struck by how different, both in tone and substance, they are today than they would have been when I was in Congress for 14 years in the 80s, when everything was defined in terms of the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union, and development assistance was basically had no more sophistication than who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. That was our strategic calculation. And we lost many, many years of supporting regimes that were inherently unpopular and tyrannical, all in some naive notion that we were advancing American national interests by thereby doing it. The second kind of general overview comment I would make is that if you look at the Africa continent today and American policy toward Africa, what is very striking is that as controversial and as contentious as most Bush-era foreign policy was around the world, the one sharp exception was Africa, where there was far more continuity than discontinuity with Clinton-era policies. There was a sharp increase in aid flows generally. You've heard Gib discuss the PEPFAR situation, which was a huge increase, and an increase that's even being further expanded significantly now. You had the Millennium Challenge Account initiative. You had also a greatly new preoccupation on a wholly nonpartisan basis of trying to build expanded trading relationships with the African continent. So the continent would no longer be treated as simply as a welfare case, but rather as a real partner in which there was a mutuality of interest to be obtained by expanding American and African interrelationships. Now there are some new challenges that we're going to be facing. I want to highlight those challenges and particularly discuss a little bit of what the Wilson Center, how the Wilson Center is contributing in some one measure, one part of this of the new challenges. You're going to find the global economic crisis presenting for Africa the same kinds of horrendously much more severe impacts upon vulnerable economies that you've heard discussed in terms of the Latin American case by Cindy. And it's going to be one of the real challenges of people who care about Africa to keep an awareness of those negative impacts, the disproportionate negative impacts on the most vulnerable of the economies in front of policymakers. You're going to find continued interest on a bipartisan basis in expanding ways of strengthening trade relationships. But there's a new recognition that simply expanding markets and opening American markets to African products will never get us there. You also must increase African capacities to produce, strengthen Africa infrastructure so farmers can get their goods to market. There's a whole range of capacity strengthening initiatives that must be taken if the full potential of wider markets in the global economy is to be seized. There's a third debate that you will find emerging that's economic related, and that is oil. And a growing recognition that oil has been far more a curse than a blessing for some of the largest African economies, which have become basically funding corruption and contributing to vastly greater inequalities within societies, and hence building in long-term instability. And there's a big debate that is raging now within the international community as to whether we should be doing more. Right now, the effort at trying to deal with the issues of oil and what investors do in these countries has been focused on voluntary initiatives, getting oil investors, for example, to be transparent in describing what transactions they are implementing with respect to producing countries. But there's some growing feeling that transparency and volunteerism are not sufficient, and that it may be time to look at something analogous to the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where American business interests will be penalized if they are not fully transparent in their dealings with such companies. There is a domestic American hook that is possible to seize that can make a huge difference on affecting the status of social and economic development in certain African nations that I think is going to be front and center in the debate this year. A fourth subject of debate will be the so-called AFRICOM. When this AFRICOM initiative was first discussed, and I was at the State Department from 1996 to 2001, it was conceived initially as simply a bureaucratic, very modest and benign bureaucratic effort to make more rational the allocation of resources devoted to Africa, because the African continent was divided among three military regimes of the United States, of the Pentagon. And however, as it began to be fleshed out in the last years of the Bush administration, it began to acquire a different feel for it. In some respects, it seemed to become a subversive way of beginning to insert ourselves in the anti-terrorism fight, of which many Africans do not want to be caught up. In other ways, it seemed as if the Pentagon was trying to create an alternative State Department. With the State Department not doing its job, it wanted to move into the job of providing development and resolving conflict and doing a lot of other things. I think there's going to be a continuing debate on that subject. I think that people are coming back to a more traditional view of what AFRICOM should be doing in the years ahead. One good news is that they're not going to try to find a headquarters for AFRICOM on the continent for some time to come, which was a very divisive subject. But I just want to highlight that one for you. And then finally, conflict. I think especially the Obama administration has been emphasizing the importance of addressing a myriad of conflicts throughout the African continent, without which you cannot have any possible success in creating the conditions for sustainable development. Among the leading conflicts that are of great concern are the continuing difficulties in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a strategic country. The Congo is as large as the entire United States east of the Mississippi, one country, and it is surrounded by 9 countries. And if the Congo cannot find stability, then the entire region of Central and Southern Africa will forever be unstable and its economic potential unrealized. It's a major strategic concern and ought to be of the global community generally and of American policy. A second is the continuing difficulties in Sudan. Even the North-South agreement, forget Darfur, even the North-South agreement is very, very tenuous, uncertain, minimal trust levels, minimum confidence levels, and no real concerted strategy at the moment for dealing with either Darfur or the North-South agreement and its implementation. Third, Somalia, the one classic failed state in East Africa, in the Horn, and in which, with the Ethiopians pulling out, some more radical Islamic elements have moved in. American policy has historically, I think, been really remiss, and this is a personal view. I think that the one area that I would disagree with the Bush administration on was this approach to Somalia policy, because we ended up giving Muslim figures in Somalia no choice but to end up supporting the more extreme elements, and we were not dealing well with that situation. And then when we attacked Somalia militarily and aligned ourselves with the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia, we added to our grief, and so that remains a huge, huge problem facing the United States. And then I would cite some issues on the West Africa coast, which are still very problematic, that there's no war at the moment: Liberia and Nigeria. Nigeria, next to South Africa and Congo, are probably the 3 most strategic countries in the African continent from American interest. And yet, Nigeria is very, very unstable. It has the long continuing, simmering conflict in the Niger Delta that is oil-centered, but relates to the fragmentation that has occurred within the region and to a lack of trust and confidence between central authorities and the Niger Delta region. I began my life as a Nigeria specialist working in the Niger Delta, so this is an area that I go back to some time, back to the 60s, in fact. And then, of course, Liberia. Everyone likes to praise Liberia as a great success story. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who's an old buddy of mine, I helped get her out of prison when I was chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, is a remarkable woman. But there is a huge tension in Liberia between the cabinet, which has been constituted of technocrats, largely well-educated Americo-Liberians on the one side, and the legislature, the Assembly and the Senate, which have been captured by representatives of the interior. And unintentionally, that historic cleavage between the better educated Americo-Liberians and the indigenous populations have been widened. And if Ellen were not on the scene tomorrow, there's no there. There's been no institutionalization of political capacity. So this is a very serious situation. Ivory Coast is likewise very tenuous, so is Sierra Leone. So there are lots of challenges that would go into the area of conflict prevention or conflict transformation and resolution. Now, one of the corollary elements of the Obama administration is a rethinking of our approach to democracy promotion, a rethinking of our approach to conflict transformation. I think there's a growing appreciation that traditional methods have been terribly flawed. We put a lot of pressure upon leaders to sign agreements, but that does not mean that the next day they see the world any differently than the day before, or that they're any better prepared to address the underlying issues that created the conflict in the first place. And instead of dealing with leaders and their mindsets and their mistrust and their perceptions, what we have done is to approach this in a very sterile way. We have a checklist of institutions that go under the label of post-conflict reconstruction. So you establish an independent electoral commission. You create the rule of law. You provide support for multi-party electoral democracy. And you go down your checklist. Well, it's not surprising that within a very few years, most countries are back at war because you've not dealt with the underlying issues, you've not dealt with the underlying perceptions, fears, and anxieties. And so when I left the government in 1991, Lee Hamilton invited me over to the Wilson Center initially as a fellow. But then the World Bank brought me on as a consultant to think with the World Bank about new strategies of peace building and democracy promotion. And I suggested to the bank that the traditional models were flawed because they didn't understand either democracy or what was happening in the real world on the ground. We tend to think of democracy as competition exclusively. And so there's been this fixation about elections and getting elections right. And we invest huge amounts of money in training up political parties and providing logistical support for elections. What we forget is that underlying all stable democracy is not only is a set of underlying agreements about what constitutes the nation, who are the members of the nation, a set of underlying agreements about the rules of the game. How is power to be organized? How is power to be shared? A set of underlying agreements about how people confront one another so that they can deal with even their political adversaries. But in transitional societies, and this is especially true in Africa, where because of the colonial experience, you have the imposition of national identities and institutions, none of those existing agreements were in place. So one way of summarizing the point is to observe that in transitional societies, these are essentially divided societies, culturally plural societies, and people have learned how to compete. That's not the challenge. The challenge is how do you collaborate? And yet all of our training programs, everything that we do at USAID and that we do at the National Endowment of Democracy, on whose board I currently serve, is devoted to strengthening competitive capacities rather than strengthening collaborative capacities. So let me close with an example of what I'm talking about, which we are hoping is beginning now to be part and parcel of American diplomacy. It's now in place in Burundi, in Liberia, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we've even designed a program for East Timor, and we may be expanding this program to Kenya this year and maybe to Togo and a few other places as well. But basically, what I suggested to the World Bank is that there were 4 imperatives that had to be addressed successfully if there was to be any hope for sustainable peace. And it was the imperatives I just mentioned in passing. You have to, first of all, change the conflict mentality of key leaders who are caught up in a winner-take-all, zero-sum mentality. They are convinced that the only way they can come out ahead is if they is at the expense of the other guy. There's no recognition of interdependence. There's no recognition of the value of collaboration. And unless people understand collaboration with even their enemies as a matter of enlightened self-interest, I don't think you can make peace sustainable anywhere. Secondly, you've got to rebuild the trust and the relationships that have been fractured by their conflict, so that people can have confidence that they will enter into agreements, those agreements will be adhered to. Thirdly, you've got to rebuild that consensus on the rules of the game, on how power is organized and shared, how decisions get made. And then finally, you've got to strengthen the skills of people and key leaders. And I don't just mean political leaders. I mean civil society, I mean military leaders as well. Training in communication and negotiation. so that people can have tools with which to solve their own problems and not be imposed upon by people from the outside. The key to conflict transformation is putting yourself in the shoes of the other. And so what I suggested to the World Bank, and they bought the experiment, was that we try to take 100 Burundian leaders, half from civil society, half from the military and political classes, and we run them through a long-term training program directed at those 4 targets, in which we really would take strategically placed leaders who were perceived by Burundians themselves as the keys to their future. Well, it was an amazing program, and within 6 months' time, we were then working with about 65 leaders, and the head of the Tutsi army and the 6 Hutu rebel groups that were participating came to us, asked us to organize training for 37 military commanders so that we could to prepare for the ceasefire that had not yet been signed. And we brought 37 military commanders into Nairobi in November of 2003 from the battlefield into this workshop. I don't know who was more frightened, they or we. But at the end of the 6 days, they had built so much cohesion that we were then asked to extend this training in many different directions. We've been in Burundi now for over 5 years. We've trained up over 100 members of a newly integrated army at the high command level, the same for the national police. And when elections were taking place and people were scared the elections were going to mean new violence, we brought together the top leaders of political parties to train them in collaborative decision-making. And in that workshop, they decided to write their own election code of conduct. They decided to issue a joint communique to the public to calm them down. They decided they wanted more joint training, and they decided they want the media present so the media could see them collaborating rather than fighting. It was very successful. And then after the election, the newly elected president asked us to continue our training with parliamentary leaders and political leaders. That work continues to this day. It was that success that led to invitations that we begin to work in Congo, Liberia, East Timor. So let me stop at this point, other than to note that one of the policy elements you'll find in the Obama papers is a call for the creation of a new mediation unit at the Department of State, which is an effort to begin to institutionalize best practices using experienced diplomats and practitioners to try to understand more clearly better means of mounting peace interventions. And I find that to be very exciting.
Thank you very much, Howard, and thank you, Cindy and Gib. Let me say 3 quick things. First of all, those of you standing have been extraordinarily patient. There are many seats back here. Please come sit down for the question period. Secondly, I wanted to mention the next 2 programs of Wilson Center on the Hill. The first I mentioned briefly at the beginning will be next Friday. It will be on Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the second program, that's February 6th. And then February 20th, Jim Reston, who is a scholar at the center, will be here to talk. He was a staffer for Mr. Frost in preparing for the Nixon-Frost debates in the 1970s. A little bit of a different program. We'll be talking about how that experience evolved in the 1970s. Jim was teaching creative writing at the University of North Carolina at the time and was hired by Frost to try and prepare him for those debates. The third thing I wanted to say, I just want to ask a quick question of my 3 colleagues. What are the 2 to 3 most important issues in your region that are going to be before the 111th Congress in your view? Very quickly, so we have half the time for questions. Cindy, and then Gib, and then Howard.
Okay, I think, turn myself off there. I think one of the most pressing issues on Latin America has to do with the approval of the free trade agreements with Colombia and Panama in particular. Those have been coupled in many ways with the trade agreement with South Korea, but if I'm just dealing with the region, I'll talk about those too. I think that the reasons that the Colombia FTA did not pass the last Congress are fairly well known. If people want to go into that in more detail, we can do that in in the Q&A. I think critical to passing a Colombia FTA, and I do think that would be a good idea. I think that free trade in general benefits developing countries as well as our country. In the case of the Colombia FTA, many people have pointed out quite rightly that Colombian products come into the United States already virtually duty-free as a result of the Andean Trade Preferences Act, whereas U.S. exports to Colombia still face high tariffs. Therefore, it's really in the interest of U.S. exporters as well to have this in place. I think for it to move forward, there will have to be some agreed-on mechanism for not only having congressional verification of human rights and labor standards, but seeing actual improvements. And I think where the debate has become a little bit sterile and has broken down is that the Colombians were saying, or the Colombian government was repeatedly emphasizing that things were so much better now under Uribe, that there were fewer trade unionists being murdered than in the past, that there were new units of the Attorney General's office looking into trade union violence, and those cases were being taken up in connection with trade unions, and there was really never any sense of what would be enough or where the bar would be set that therefore would qualify Colombia for this FTA. And I think it will be incumbent mostly on Democrats in collaboration, with Republicans to come up with a set of standards and procedures, and I think also just as important, come up with a mechanism that will allow Congress a role in overseeing how well the agreement is being implemented. Related to Colombia, I think there will be a debate over Plan Colombia. Overall, Colombia and the Andean region have gotten about $700 million in economic and military aid in the earlier part of this decade. That fell somewhat in the last year to about $500 million. But there is, I think, widespread recognition, most recently pointed out by the General Accountability Office in a report in October, that the drug fighting strategy based on widespread eradication of coca is simply not working. One could easily argue that there would be a lot more coca and cocaine coming into the United States, a lot more coca grown in the Andes, if these eradication strategies had not been pursued. But if the goal is to reduce the flow of drugs into the United States and to reduce the number of drug consumers in this country, it clearly has not helped. And this is going to become, I think, a huge issue in the debate over Mexico and the demand from the Mexican government that the United States do more to prevent the $15 to $25 billion in profits that are generated each year in the purchase of drugs that flow back into Mexico in terms of illegal weapons and cash. And a final area that I would encourage the Congress to look at, and I think this is an issue that needs to be created as opposed to one that will present itself somewhat on its own terms, is a way to find or to help Latin American countries cushion the effects of the economic recession, as Howard was mentioning, for the especially for the economically vulnerable populations. There have been some important advances in the region in the last 5 years, in particular, in reducing poverty, much less, I think, progress in reducing levels of inequality. And one of the most important mechanisms for reducing poverty has been the cash transfer programs pioneered by Mexico through the Oportunidades program, but also, I think, made probably the most into a household name under President Lula in Brazil with the Bolsa Familia. These have involved cash transfers to poor families in exchange for keeping children in school, making sure that children have preventive health care, and they've made a significant impact on the quality of life. They are not expensive as percentages of government budgets. It's less than 0.5% of GDP, and I think maintaining the capacity of Latin American countries to provide the social safety net as literally millions of people are thrown out of work and into the informal sector, if they can even enter the informal sector, will be a key task in cushioning the effects of this crisis.
Thank you, Cindy. Gabe, very quickly. Yep.
Well, I think there's a lot to choose from, but I think one thing that will definitely affect health, and health will have a part of the conversation, though I think how big of a part of the conversation remains to be seen is just the general conversation about the reorganization of foreign assistance in general. USAID, State Department, Millennium Challenge Corporation, big programs like PEPFAR, et cetera. There's a lot of players. There's a lot of discussion of which box should go where and this sort of thing. And I think a lot of how this reorganization shapes up will affect health, and again, how much health has to say in this will depend on a few things. I think maybe most importantly, who's named the new head of USAID. That's one thing. The second thing I think is what I was alluding to earlier. The diseases like AIDS and TB and malaria that have gotten so much money and attention. Will there be an either-or, continue funding them, or start funding maternal health, child health, family planning, tropical diseases, or will it be both? And will there be friction between those communities, or will it be cooperation? Will maternal health and child health become part of PEPFAR and other HIV programs, that sort of thing? And then I think a maybe is if the economy continues to fall here and abroad, will prioritizing public health and international assistance in general continue to be a priority, or will it be seen as funds that we could be using here at home? And sort of related to that, will there be some sort of donor fatigue that kicks in as these programs, turn 10 and 15 years old?
Thanks, Howard. Very quickly,
Yeah, I would take off on Gibbs' last point, because the real danger here is, given all the economic pressures, is that we back off both levels of assistance, and we back off Obama's very clear pledges and Hillary Clinton's very clear pledges to increase the numbers of personnel at state, supported by Gates and others. We have to increase our diplomatic capacity. In Africa especially, we're understaffed, don't have the resources, and we're all and American interests are being sacrificed in the process. And so that, I would argue, ought to be a real focus. There's also a lot of interest in Congress, and I think this will be reflected in the next few weeks. You'll be hearing a rollout, I believe, of some of this, of creation of new special envoys for both the Congo and the Sudan, and maybe other areas down the road. I know that there's an interest, a recognition that the Nigeria case is very serious and has received far too little attention by American policymakers.
Thank you very much. The floor is all yours, and thank you for being so attentive. And just raise your hand, I guess, and get up. And again, preference would be for those working on Capitol Hill to ask questions first, but I leave it to you. Just fire away, maybe identify who should answer the question. Thank you. What's that?
Do you need to use the microphone?
No, they don't need to. Go ahead. Come on, don't be so quiet and shy.
Okay.
Somebody? Yes, good.
Well, I have a question. One of the issues that seems to be coming more to the fore in international development talk is not only economic growth, but climate change. Do you think that the Congress will look at options for climate change, or green jobs, which is there's a new green jobs initiative report? Does that seem to be something that would be new in development assistance?
Yes.
That's kind of a rambling question.
No, I think you're going to find tremendous emphasis. First of all, we've never had as many high-quality environmental advocates within a single administration as we have in this administration. And so there'll be a push from the administration, and then with the change of the leadership of the Energy and Commerce Committee, there'll be subsequent support for that direction in Congress. That's huge. And there's a growing recognition in international foray of having to deal on a global basis with these issues and giving something for the lesser developed countries in that exchange. So, yeah, I think this is going to be very much a new feature.
Gibber or Cindy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. I think from the health perspective, it's a big concern because obviously if you have something really dramatic like sea level rises, you have some mass migrations and displacement of people and all the issues that brings. But already we're seeing with higher temperatures in certain places, malaria and other vector-borne diseases are being found in higher elevation areas where they've never been found before. So it's already showing its face. In terms of the environment, I mean, I agree with Howard. I think it's high on the administration's priority list, and then the follow-on to Kyoto is meeting this December in Copenhagen, and I would look for some strong action from Obama and the U.S. to happen there.
Sure. I would also mention that with respect to Latin America and the Caribbean, the Summit of the Americas that will take place in April of this year in Port of Spain, Trinidad, has as one of the central issues on the agenda the question of climate change. Caribbean countries, being coastal countries and islands, are extremely vulnerable to rises in sea levels, and it's also very related to to energy development in Latin America, which is a key priority. The sense that many countries that have been traditional oil exporters, such as Mexico, are running out of known reserves or they're being depleted. This is also, I think, the case in Colombia. Other countries such as Brazil and Venezuela have vast undeveloped deposits. At the same time, energy-consuming countries, the countries that are overall dependent on energy imports, like Chile, for example, are looking for alternative forms of energy, including nuclear energy, but I think would be open to green, environmentally sustainable energy if it were found to be economically viable and producible on a large enough scale.
I might just add that the nexus of environment and health is the issue of fresh water. And we at the Center have done a lot of work on water, and I would suspect that that's one way you'll see that debate come forward. In the blue shirt, yes.
I was going to add to what you're saying, if we could just hit on fresh water issues in these three regions.
I'm not the expert. I'm an inch deep and 5 miles wide. But does somebody else want to say a word about
The fellow who is the expert on that is Jeffrey DeBelco.
He's in the back.
And he's in the back.
Oh, there you are, Jeff. By God. Do you want to say a word about it, Jeff?
Well, I guess I would just echo again that I won't venture into regional breakdowns of various issues, but I think you will see there's a lot of energy and interest on in both the House and the Senate to find ways to put forward the 2005 Senate
My hurts from the coffee. Thank you.
Heavy emphasis is on water sanitation and health. I guess I would make a plea for a strong approach on that, but not forgetting some other critical things like transboundary water and integrated development that is some of the infrastructure issues. Can you hear me? And even going further when you're talking about climate change, you look for ways that asking questions about what are the water stations or a sustainable way to grow our energy based on our water availability here, but also a very rich agenda the next Congressman.
I think if you go to www.wilsoncenter.org and you look up the Environmental Change and Security Program, you can find some of that stuff on water. There was a question, yes.
I wanted to ask how would it be had
No, my hope is that we don't throw our hands up in despair, that we continue to engage very vigorously. And engagement means not only trying to lean on Mugabe, it means giving support to the pro-democracy forces inside Zimbabwe. And it means continuing to press the Southern African states, through SADC and South Africa in particular, to take a much more public posture. I worked with Mugabe for many years. That's one of the reasons I was appointed special envoy, because I have unique access to Mugabe. And for many years, I was very supportive of Mbeki's approach to that, because next to the Zimbabweans, no one stands to lose more than the South Africans. Every time things get worse in Zimbabwe, there's a refugee flow. So it wasn't for lack of trying, and I think that the United States and the Western world playing the bad cop and Mbeki playing the good cop, there was a certain logic to that, up to the point he essentially denied the outcome of that election. And from that point forward, his credibility just collapsed among the MDC, the opposition groups, and South Africa's diplomacy has weakened. So I think that we just have to continue to push all these angles that we can and remain engaged. And the moment Mugabe is out of there, because he will be there at some point, be prepared to jump in with a major initiative. The Zimbabweans are well educated. They are extraordinarily resourceful people, and I really think that absent Mugabe, I think there's a chance to turn this around quickly.
Yes, and the yellow sweater.
We hear two different things here, and that's part of the challenge in developing countries. We heard about the overarching water or the environment, and then the development in the individual communities, what you do to build the economy ground up. How do you marry those two challenges? Obviously, that must not be a very good question. But the challenge of building communities one at a time is key. I think I heard someone say earlier to the development of the country. How do you marry that with the overarching?
Okay. Well, you do have throughout the African continent these regimes. The Okavango Delta is one example of a water basin area which is multi-country. And one of the goals has been there to increase the cohesion of these states, to be more effective at developing win-win strategies for all in the allocation of resources, water resources, and the use of, location of industrial activity, and so on. The more you can get that regional approach to a more rational allocation of water, the more you will help and sustain the national economic development activities of each. If that's the thrust of your question, I think that's right. The place that's most developed, I think, is Southern Africa. They're trying to make a similar effort now up in the Congolese, in the Congo River area, but also even more up in the Horn. And the whole issue of the use of the Nile still remains a critical question.
Cindy, do you want to add to that?
I can take a slightly different stab at this and talk about the importance of rural development in Andean countries that are producers and exporters of cocaine. I think that that's an area where there has not been enough attention and effort. It's providing credit to farmers, but it's also providing infrastructure that will allow them to market a crop and have some realistic alternative. And I think that there are ways to develop those projects that are ecologically sound and that would benefit on any number of fronts. And I think a country such as Colombia, in which 70% of the population lives in urban areas, has not at all paid enough attention to rural development because it is the countryside which is really the epicenter of not only coca cultivation but also guerrilla and resurgent paramilitary activity.
Just one quick point on top of that, to echo what Howard said earlier about developing countries being our partners, not just somewhere where we go to dump money, but so they're partners, and the people there are. We're investing in the people, in the human infrastructure as much as we are in the built infrastructure.
Yeah.
Rural development is key. We have 50% of the people in this world already living in cities, and we don't need more people coming into the cities. Right behind the yellow shirt, and then over back here, and then to the center.
A question about, there's been a recent surge in drug trafficking through West Africa, the involvement of Latin American cocaine
Well, I mean, it's not that new. I mean, there may be a recent surge, but this has been a major problem, the drug trafficking, for years and years. I've seen the numbers, and it really is staggering, the amount of drugs that transit Nigeria, for example. It's really staggering. I don't know that instability is a likely outcome, but you're certainly not doing much to control the international drug trade and creating a whole underworld of a criminal underworld that is operating with pretty much impunity in that part of the world. So it's a huge issue. The American government is more and more seized of it, providing resources, law enforcement, other resources to that end. But we've got a long ways to go.
It's a demand and a supply issue. The lady back there, yeah.
I'm extremely interested in the kind of different approach that's come from both Latin America and Africa. I mean, it seems to me when you talk about Africa, you look more kind of structural approach, whereas in Latin America, you look at how you can do more rural development, development, and looking more kind of things like Wolpe in India in order to achieve the aims of American foreign policy. And I'm just interested that you choose to be looking more strategically in Africa and less at kind of the ideas with rural development and but also be focusing on and where that tension will play out and how you see that playing out. And also a second question, and that is how you think things like other countries like China and their increasing influence in Africa will also play out.
Right. I'm not sure I heard the first part of your question precisely. You're saying that, how did you characterize your understanding of my discussion of Africa?
No, because it seems you've been focusing a lot less on things like development. You've been talking a lot more about
Oh, yeah.
Reconciliation.
I see. Yeah. That may be a function of the severity of the conflicts facing the two regions. It might be
And the threat of failed states.
And the threat of failed states. It may also be a consequence of my particular interest, which is the conflict transformation dimension. I'm not an economist. I'm not a development economist. But I would argue that there is no hope for sustainable economic development anywhere in Central or Southern Africa if those conflicts I've described to you are not rolled down, unless we can get control of them. So in sequential terms, I would argue that is the first thing that has to happen, or you can never build an integrated economic network. And most of these countries, not all, most are too small to be self-contained economic units. So their only hope for economic prosperity and development long term is to be part of a wider flow of capital and goods and in a regionally integrated network. So that's why I emphasize the conflict dimension. On the China thing, just answer the China thing quickly. I am much less concerned about the alleged China threat. I think in some ways the China presence has been very beneficial. They've produced some good projects. The Chinese are also discovering, though, that it's not easy doing business in China. And I think that we had wanted them to play a more active role in human rights advocacy, for example, in Darfur. They're starting to do that. And elsewhere in Africa, I know of one embassy, which I will not mention here, where there's a weekly conversation between our DCM and their DCM, in which the Chinese DCM is complaining constantly about doing business in that country and wanting there to be a more regularized set of relationships. So I think over time, as the Chinese engage internationally, they'll become part of the normative, more of the normative approach to development that characterizes the Western world.
Sure. I'll just make two brief comments to take your first question. As you probably know, I mean, Latin America is the most unequal region in the entire world, and there's a lot of inequality, in particularly in the developing world. But Latin America really leads the pack, and there is therefore, I think, a greater demand for development strategies to have a distributional impact, and they have a distributional impact only when there is when there are secondary policies that go along with trade, for example, to enhance the developmental impact, of free trade. And there's a huge debate in the region that's been underway for at least a decade, which is a response and a reaction against the kinds of so-called neoliberal reforms that were advanced under the Washington Consensus, which said to countries, open your markets and liberalize your trade and privatize everything and let the free market work its way. Well, that did to a certain extent create growth. It did not reduce inequality. And so the one of the explanations for this wave of elections of leaders on the left end of the political spectrum, both the sort of populist left as well as the social democratic left, has been this sense that the benefits of growth have not been widely shared and distributed throughout society. So there is a sense, that leaders have now of wanting to tame the market and reestablish and reassert a central role for the state, not only in development, not just in nationalizing industries, although that has happened in a number of countries that I think we know about, but also having the state play a more sort of modernized regulatory role. There is very little, in my view, way too little tax reform that would help even out, some of the inequality issues. On the question of China, China has been a huge economic presence in the region, primarily as a consumer of primary commodities produced in Latin America, both soy and soy products grown in Argentina and Brazil, minerals such as copper. I think Chile exports about a fifth of its copper production, to China. So there's been a huge amount of Chinese investment in extractive industries, a fair amount of Chinese competition in manufactured exports, which I think has been an issue primarily for Mexico, which has a very developed manufacturing base. So China is welcomed as a growing market. Chinese investment is welcomed as a way of counterbalancing the influence of the United States. There is, I think, some concern that the kind of product that China looks for in Latin America is sort of reinforcing Latin America's role as an export enclave of primary commodities. And so there is a fair amount of debate. From what I understand, a number of Chinese investments in extractive industries in places such as Peru have not been terribly sensitive to, environmental standards and environmental quality, and some of the plants are among the dirtiest of possible industries in that regard. So, it's a double-edged, coin in this time of economic retrenchment. China undoubtedly will play a lesser role as its growth levels decrease. Its demand for primary commodities will also go down, and there's also a political dimension to it. I mean, quite frankly, I forget the number, but there's some very high percentage of countries that have extended formal political and diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, which are in Central America, the Caribbean, and I think one South American country. And so China obviously is jockeying to wean some of those countries away, and it's happening. I mean, Costa Rica withdrew its recognition of Taiwan, has recognized China, and I think most people want to be part of or among the places that China looks to when it looks at Latin America for investment and trade opportunities.
On the aisle, yeah.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Wolpe. As South Africa, one of the continent's key democracies, is lining up for an election this April, I just would like to know if you have any insight on what that means for the stability of the broader region, but also the continent at large, given that this is very well the staunchest challenge this African country since its transition to democracy in 1994.
Yeah, I am generally optimistic. I think there's going to be a period of a lot of angst and turmoil, but I think that the strength of the underlying institutions is such that South Africa will weather this transition. Most betting is that Zuma will emerge as the next president, if he were to be found guilty of corruption at some point, he would have to pull out and someone else would take his place. But and there is a split between the parties or within the ANC. So the ANC is likely to do not as well as they would have done earlier, particularly in some of the provinces. But no one thinks that, and they may not get their 2/3 within the national parliament, which gives them an ability to change the constitution. But they still should do relatively well, as the most prognosticators are indicating. So a lot remains to be played out yet, especially in terms of the whole Zuma affair. But I think at this stage, I'm not as anxious about the ultimate. In fact, in some ways, the emergence of this other party could become a useful beginning to build a higher degree of political pluralism within the society.
Thank you, Howard. Lady in front, and then next.
Okay, Jennifer Key from the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Certainly, if you had any comments on MCC, I'd love to hear those. But my question specifically is, what are your views on this idea of a triple hat, a singular administrator for UK, FR, and MCC, and what pros and cons do you see with that?
Many of them. Yeah, I might invoke the above my pay grade term on this one, but I think the main pro is just that there's certainly a lot of overlap in terms of the issues they're addressing. So having a common approach, having common values, common goals, common implementation schemes, and no duplication in terms of regional programs. I think that's the main, to me that's the main pro. I think the main con is that they all have their personalities they've developed, they all have their own way of doing things that I think offer strengths, and the process of merging them I think would be at least initially painful. Yeah, that's my main opinion on it.
If I could just add a couple of quick thoughts. I've been a very strong backer of the MCC, and was one of those unwilling to join in the criticism about the slowness of the laying out of the funds, because it seems to me that if you make the really solid investment on the front end and know what you're doing, then you're going to be a lot better down the road. So I'm not that critical about that particular issue, but there's some in Congress that are, as you know. The other comment I would make, though, is, and I think that the whole reform dimension, that is providing incentives for countries to go through certain reforms, if they meet the reform objective, then not being as prescriptive in what they do, but allowing them much greater flexibility and autonomy makes all sorts of sense to begin to reduce the excessive conditionality that has historically been America's approach to development assistance. That makes sense. The third comment, though, is that we need to understand that there are some countries that may not make the MCC targets, but nonetheless have huge developmental or other challenges that can't just be washed away and ignored. And so you need to have a variegated economic assistance policy that is responsive to different situations. And I think that is one of the major concerns that critics of the MCC have, that that latter is not being attended to well.
Yes.
Part of a regional project.
Thank you. Now, yes. And then you.
How, this I think this relates both to Africa and Latin America, how the rise of kind of volunteer tourism is playing out in that country, how NGOs can have a role in development and possibly hitting as well.
On tourism? Tourism has enormous capacity to generate foreign exchange, and I think a number of countries, I know of several cases in Central America, are beginning to establish themselves as destinations for ecotourism and for young people from Europe, the United States, whatever. I'm not an expert on that industry. I think in general, the development of tourism that does not magnify the lifestyle differences between the tourists that come and the people that reside in an area is the preferable way to go. But I do see that the natural beauty and resources of countries in Latin America are sort of no-brainers in terms of the potential for tourism development. As for a role for NGOs, I'm not sure. Perhaps in working with Latin American countries and ministries of tourism to build in some sense of how to do this in a sustainable way, in providing models of what would be attractive to certain populations that are not necessarily the same populations that would want to get on a cruise ship and go to a casino.
Yes, gentleman here and then over here.
Congressman, I'm concerned that Africa may pay a price for the West's carbon dioxide mania, the way it did for the West's ET mania in the 60s and 70s when the European aid agency wouldn't support malaria reduction efforts of using DDT because of concerns about its widespread use in the West. I think the World Bank's carbon offset trading program that allows European countries to keep emitting, but they buy credits for things that African governments claim to do, is pretty fraudulent, but it doesn't really hurt anybody in Africa and actually provides some new resources. But what I'm concerned about is whether Africa will be supported by people like OPEC or the World Bank or other aid agencies in power, traditional power construction, particularly using coal, as their economic needs rise, as in Southern Africa there's equal power and there's coal there. Will they be denied the ability to build the kind of coal plants that fuel economic growth around the world because of the West's insistence now that coal is a threat for our national
Can I just say a word? I'd just like to say hello and welcome Caleb Rossiter. I should have noticed you before. I think I noticed your shirt, and I should have then said, oh, okay, that must be Caleb. Caleb is a resource, I think, for all of you. He's been on the Hill for decades, has a lot of experience. We worked together very closely on the issues of Central America in the 1980s, and if you want to have a good sense about, how to do the right thing, be in touch with Caleb.
I'm not sure. I'm not been very close to the recent analysis and sort of preparation for negotiations that will be going on in the months ahead on the subject of how best to manage this difficult relationship. I have a gut sense that there will be enormous pressure on African countries to adopt alternatives to coal, and that there will be, and particularly in the African context, the use of solar and of renewable energy resources with some institutional support to get beyond institutional constraints could yield very rapid market penetration in Africa if it were done well and correctly. I attended one recent meeting of some environmental experts, and I was stunned to find how far the technology has progressed and how much cheaper it is now, but there hasn't been made that central effort at pulling this all together, which governments can do, but which the private sector have more difficulty providing that initial impetus. But I would be very surprised. I think the general perception now is that the situation with respect to carbon is so great that we need to get away from coal, pure and simple, away from fossil fuels, need to do everything we can to try. But you're quite right. There could put additional pressures that will be resisted by countries like Africa who have much lesser contribution to that historically and would now feel aggrieved by it.
Over here.
Let me continue from where I was stopped. Talking about the code, Chad banned the use of charcoal 2 weeks ago. And it was a sudden decision. So sudden that people now are using, and some of the people are paying even 30% not of the bill. So there is a suggestion that this might be suspended for some time while other benefits are talking about Chad and the doing this, what I was saying about all the transparency of oil industry. They are also a various experience by the World Bank in order to set up a fund for future generations with Chad. Then Chad started exporting oil. Unfortunately, this was short-lived because Chad convinced or put pressure on the World Bank to suspend it because they needed this for their security. Shows you how security and conflict resolution is so important because there are always competing demands. And my final point is to support our Wolpe concerning the issue, the importance of leadership training. When Woodrow Wilson Center started leadership training in Burundi, I was there. I was part of the peacekeeping mission in Burundi in 2003. And I have seen it myself the importance of the contribution made by this center. It's extremely valuable. And this makes me think that we should now try and make this training as part and parcel of negotiations, of peace negotiations. I'd like to hear our views on this. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, let me just say, Nuruddin Sati is a long-time diplomat, former ambassador, and very involved in the United Nations system, especially on the UNESCO side of the system, for many years, and then was this remarkable deputy SRSG in Burundi, and for a short period of time, SRSG as well, and knows the region exceptionally well, Sudanese by background, and married to a Somali woman, so he has some feel for the dynamics of the entire Horn as well. My own view is that I've never understood why diplomats think that somehow, if you have people who are in conflict and who do not trust each other, who are suspicious of one another, to think that somehow they're making a major contribution to peace by bringing them together to begin as the first point of conversation a discussion of the issues that divide them. That to me is ludicrous on its face. And so what we've been trying to do in the work we've done, which has been more oriented to post-conflict, could just as easily be done in terms of preparation for negotiations, is bringing people together for some days of training designed first to build the confidence, to break down the barriers, to change the paradigm, to give people skills, and then to turn to substance. In our experience, that is one heck of a lot more cost-effective. The problem we discovered is that there are very few diplomats in the world, at the United States, at the Foreign Service, or anywhere else in the European world, anywhere, that have been trained up in the techniques of negotiation, mediation, conflict transformation. As remarkable a statement as that is, diplomats have good understanding of the politics of divided societies. They have access to national leaders. They know the regional diplomatic environment, but they don't have these skills and these techniques. The trainers, the facilitators that have these skills, organizational specialists, they are sometimes termed, seldom have access to national leaders, don't know much about the politics. And so what you need is a synergy, bringing together diplomats and trainers to do this work jointly. That's what we define as the value added now of the Wilson Center, and what we're trying to do with our program there.
This project has been extraordinarily important, and I think one of the most important things in the elite reconciliation meetings that Howard has is that when everybody comes in to a meeting, they leave their title at the door, and they just have a first name. And that's the start of the process of breaking down divisions and trying to build collaboration. I guess we even need some collaboration here in the United States as well, across lines. I want to thank you all for being so attentive. The next meeting that we will have will be on India, China, Russia, and Brazil, and it will be same place, same time, next Friday. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Also,
one other thing, the gentleman mentioned a program at noon today.
I'm not sure about that.
That is not a Wilson Center program, I believe. It's a Corporate Council on Africa.
It's 1 to 2.
Yeah.
It's being sponsored by Wilson Center Corporate Council together. But you're correct. It's at the Corporate Council headquarters, which I believe is 1117th Street. The check will be here.
good. Also, many of you came in after the Africa materials were at the desk.
Yeah.
You may want to take those on your way
Latin
out.
American materials as well, right outside the door. Thank you for being so attentive. Have a good weekend.